As always, the Minding Your Business podcast is brought to you by Brooks Brothers Consulting. We are a leadership talent development firm, as well as business development for sales organizations, particularly with financial institutions. And so my brother Philip and I started in June 2013, and we're working with financial institutions, mostly in the regional sense, at various sizes, and helping them develop sales, service, operations, and employee engagement, specifically with retail and business banking platforms. In addition, we work with small business owners to help them uncover business development opportunities, networking, and things like that. So you'll want us on your team to help you strategically plan and come up with executable strategies for your business. So that's brooksbrothersconsulting.com is where you need to go, 901-808-3801. Again, that's 901-808-3801. Whew, we've made it to October the 5th. There is a ton going on in this country that we refer to as the United States of America. But we've reached episode number 64, which is titled Memphis Burning. This is part one of a two-part series. And so without any delay, let's hit the music.
What we do here is go back. So, again, thank you so much, podcast listeners. Thank you so much, those on Facebook Live and everybody. I'm your host, Champ Ron. This is the Minding Your Business podcast. We are live here from the great city of Memphis, Tennessee, right here on the bluffs off the Mississippi River. A great city, but it's a city that we're going to talk about some of the existing culture challenges that the city has. And I want to introduce my guest here shortly, but a ton going on in the city. Let me address something very quickly. My guest and I, we also had the chance to go to Memphis Madness on last night, which was absolutely positively phenomenal. Shout out to everybody at the University of Memphis. Shout out to all the administrators, Coach Anthony Penny Hardaway, the players, men's and women's teams. It was a phenomenal night and a great look for the city, where you had over 18,000 strong in FedEx Forum in downtown Memphis. It demonstrate the excitement that Coach Hardaway has brought for many who grew up watching him. Maybe if you didn't, you're on the younger side and you didn't have the opportunity to watch him. You're talking about a hell of a player who's beyond that. He's a great advocate for the city and has been even prior to him coaching. And so many have had interactions with him and certainly have admired his play and admired his fiduciary duty as he's been in the Memphis community coaching and developing youth. And now he has the opportunity to do that at the University of Memphis. Team's going to be good. They're going to, in my opinion, they're going to have some opportunities offensively. I think defensively they're going to be very strong. And so we're going to see how they're going to look. The women's team kind of in the same fashion. I think defensively they're long. They're going to have some opportunity. Offensively, it's going to take them a few games, just like the men's team, to get that cracking. But once they do, they're going to be strong. So, but again, welcome. I'm your host, Champ Ron. This is episode 64, and I'm extremely excited to have a special guest here in the building with me, Mr. Darren Ballard. Darren, what's up, man?
What's going on, man? You all right?
You good?
I'm good, man.
Yeah, man, good to see you.
Good to see you too, man.
Yeah, it's good to be seen.
Always good to be seen.
No doubt about it. So, Darren, talk to us a little bit about your background. Mm-hmm. I know today's topic is near and dear to your heart, but I know you've been involved in several things and several projects all around, and so share with the audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Darren Ballard. I'm a writer, content creator. I've worked on several projects with professional athletes as far as their digital properties. So mostly my thing is writing, content creation, and pretty much just around the city, doing a lot of stuff around the city with different people. And
right.
So I'm always looking to network and collaborate, which is why I'm so glad that I got the opportunity to come here and speak with you about this particular project.
Yeah. Definitely. No doubt about it, man. And like I said, I'm just glad to have you. How can people connect with you?
You can connect with me on Twitter, Ballard State, Ballard State. Instagram, Blizzy Ballard, BLIZZY BALLARD. Facebook, Darren Ballard. So any of those places, I'm there.
Cool. Dig that. And it's always good to have a content creative guy on your team.
Yeah, man.
So
always.
Yeah, that's always a thing. So, today's episode, episode 64, and it's part 1 of Memphis Burning. And, Darren, I've got an article here that was shared with me by my guy, Elliot Sales, with Maine T-shirts. And you guys need to check that out. I've said it on the podcast before. MaineT-shirts.com is the move that you need to make to get your Maine T-shirts. But he shared this a few days ago that really blew my doors off. And it's an article titled Memphis Burning. It was done by a gentleman named Preston Lauterbach back in March of 2016. And it's one of the best written articles, just in my opinion, that I've seen in related to any kind of historical subject, because it was while it was concise, it was also very detailed, which is a little bit unusual. Sometimes you can get wordy and things like that, but it speaks to a subject that I want to get right to in terms of some of the history of Memphis and the history of how Memphis culture has came to be in terms of social, economic, and things like that, and even racial inequality. And I want to tie that in from a business perspective. And so what I'm going to do today here on the podcast is I'm going to read a few excerpts from the article. Of course, we don't have the time for me to sit and no one wants to hear me read the article the whole time. But what I do want to do is I want to make sure that I capture some excerpts from it, and then Darren and I, let's talk about it, man. Yeah. And let's get your thoughts on it. Some people, Sharon Jackson, with knowledge comes pain and healing is the victory. Yep, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. That's a very fitting quote for what we're going to go through today. Here's something that I want to start off with, Darren, if you don't mind this. This is an excerpt from the article that I just referenced in terms of Memphis Burning by Preston Lauterbach. And it starts out as this. In the afternoon of February 26, 1953, fire destroyed a landmark in South Memphis on Lauderdale Street. A stately 3-story home with 18 rooms and twin gables burned from its spirals down. Okay? This is February 26, 1953. The actual specific location is 384 Lauderdale Street. So for those in Memphis, if you've been in Memphis for some time, that is definitely in the South Memphis area, coming off of kind of wedged off of Midtown and downtown. So it kind of comes to this wedge. 384 South Lauderdale Street. On February 26, 1953, it was burned down. This was a house that was owned by one Mr. Robert Reed Church, who built this home 70 years prior to it being burned down in 1883. Robert Church, he's Robert Church Sr., by the way, although he was born a slave, so he was born prior to emancipation, and so he was born in this country as a slave, and he transitioned from that, and he became actually the South's first black millionaire. So he was the South's first black millionaire. He did that through real estate, consequently. And he was one of the ones, he helped establish Memphis even through the 1870s when you had yellow fever epidemic that took out a lot of the population and things like that. Mr. Church was one of the ones who helped rebuild the city and kind of helped it thrive and leading African Americans into this kind of period of having opportunities for great housing that resided in that South Memphis area. He also was tied to things, as far as starting up a bank. He was tied to things specifically around Beale Street. So the iconic street that's here in downtown Memphis that many of you on the podcast have visited or you've heard about. That was once a thriving African American business community that you had there. And his son, who is Robert Church Jr., grew up in this particular house that was burned down. Darren, let me ask you, just to start out, what are your I guess, initial thoughts on when you hear something like that, even before you get into some of the specifics of what happened, which we're going to do here in a second, but just what I shared with you in 1953, a house that is in a neighborhood that at the time was very diversely populated, so South Memphis wasn't what those of us today think of South Memphis as. South Memphis was designed as a racially diverse, kind of prosperous area where you had even prosperous whites that lived there. Let me share with you as I ask this question, Darren, too, man. Let me just tell you who lived there. You had the families of U.S. Senator Kenneth McKellar, who lived in this neighborhood, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas, and then many kind of successful blacks. You had City Councilman Limas Wallace and Julia and Charles Hooks. All these, so these are prominent families that have, ties that you see today here in the community. So what's your initial thought when you hear about a house burning down in that type of area?
The first thing I think of is symbolism. When the house burned down, of course, no one was living there at the time. But for them to burn down that particular house and what it stood for blacks in that community and the blacks, all across the city, I think about it as strong symbolism. And in America, that's one of the biggest things that we use to either group people together or tear them apart. Right. It's symbolism. So that's one of the biggest things I think of when I first read that and saw that they had burnt the house down.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I think of the same thing too, and we're going to talk about that some, man, is the symbolism of why that was done and what it represents. Right. And man, you're right, in this country, symbolism is used a lot to deliver messages and to kind of embed messages into minds and into visual sight. So just a little bit more about the neighborhood. So we talked about Robert Church Sr. So when Robert Church Jr. was born, he's referred to as Bob. When Robert Church Jr. was born, he was born in 1885. So he's born post-emancipation, that sort of thing. So he grows up in this house. There were 10 black families on 3 blocks of South Lauderdale. Again, this is in South Memphis. This is in the time when he's young. In 1900, there were 11 black households. In 1910, there were 10. This was a stable, racially mixed neighborhood in the heart of the South during what were bleak decades for African Americans. So, when I look at this and I look at, so you've got a generation of blacks that grow up in this racially, when you talk about Junior, grow up in this racially diverse area. Okay? And you've got, so just from a legacy standpoint, you've got Robert Church Sr., who's now grooming his sons to not only take care of this home, at this time, but in all these businesses. And Robert Church Sr. was part of the Republican Party, which sounds a little interesting for people hearing that, people who are not familiar with this history. So, Darren, can you talk about, him being part of the Republican Party and kind of what that meant at that time,
Right.
and how different that is.
At that time, the Republican Party was the party of Reconstruction after the emancipation, and they were pretty much, of course, Lincoln was a Republican president. They were pretty much tasked with not only helping the freedmen get housing, different things like that. They were also tasked with bringing the Confederate states back into the Union. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much they were reconstructing the entire country.
Right.
So at this time, blacks were one of the main focuses of that Reconstruction for the Republican Party. It was one of the only ways that they could keep the country together was to get that population stable,
right?
So that the country could heal from the Civil War. Mm-hmm. So that's just a little background of why they were Republicans.
Yeah. Okay. And then compare that to the Democratic Party at the time. So
the Democratic Party, and in the South they call them Dixiecrats.
Right.
The Democratic Party is pretty much what you would think of as a Republican today. They were more conservative.
Yeah. Yeah, they were more like kind of, pro small government, again, they basically flip-flopped ideologies. And keep in mind, folks, we're talking about the time frame of the early 20th century. So the early 1900s, so 1910, 1920, 1930s.
Right.
This was a time when, like Darren's saying, man, the parties had kind of inversed ideologies. And so when people think of, Robert Church Jr. as being a Republican, that's different than you think of the Republican Party as of today. So I just wanted to, I appreciate you giving that distinction.
Just to add on to that, you might hear that, and a lot of times you probably heard Republicans now use that as a talking point as far as blacks and Republicans, but you have to think it was a totally different time from now.
Right. Yeah, you will hear some politicians that will come up and say, "Oh, well, there was a time where you guys always voted Republican and things like that. The Democrat Party's this, and that," and not understanding that they basically flip-flopped again ideology. So not to get too much into that. So the article goes into. So you have this time of the church family, and you've got growths in black population that's happening during this time because people are transitioning from the Deep South, where they're experiencing extreme overt racism and inequality, practices, behaviors, things like that, and of course they're migrating north. Tennessee was an early migrating point. Then you had blacks that transitioned all the way up north into the Northeast and then out west. But particularly here in Tennessee, you've got this period, and South Memphis is kind of a collection of, as these people are coming, they're finding an area where they can thrive and, again, have nice housing.
And just with that, it just wasn't an anomaly in the city. This was pretty much an anomaly across the whole country. There were not many cities and many neighborhoods that had blacks and whites living together. Prominent blacks and whites living together. Not just, poor blacks and whites. I'm talking about people that had money, people that were important in the city and government, doing different things. So.
Yeah, definitely. No doubt about it. And so, the article then goes into, it starts to talk about this rising power of one Edward Hull Boss Crump, who's referred to as Boss Crump here. He was a white Democrat who moved to Memphis from Holly Springs, Mississippi, which is also originally where Robert Church Sr. Was born, which is Holly Springs, Mississippi, just a little bit south of the greater Memphis area. Boss Crump, as he was referred to, was elected mayor of Memphis in 1909 at the age of 35. He was 35 years old. He becomes the mayor of Memphis. In 1916, of course, he resigns. And his reign kind of over the city, or his influence over the city, actually expanded into the 1950s, where he and Robert Church were kind of running buddies in the sense. They ran together. They were responsible for kind of developing the political scene here. So you didn't get elected in this city, essentially, if you didn't have a conversation with Robert Church and one Boss Crump during that time.
Right.
So,
and, of course, Church was a Republican, and they pretty much were running things at that time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Crump used him. They pretty much had a symbiotic relationship as far as politics and economics in Memphis.
Yeah, definitely. And so that was interesting in that you have essentially a black Republican and a white Democrat, which people would think that's crazy.
Think about that: a black Republican and a white Democrat. That's like a bad joke or something.
Right. Yeah. That's the start of a joke.
Right. Joke.
A black Republican and a white Democrat with a bar. Right. Yeah. So this is a bad joke, but. So in the 1920s, Boss Crump and Robert Church led a bipartisan, biracial coalition that controlled Memphis politics and elected most of its officials. And I'm reading from the article. Crump encouraged the black vote, and in return, Church used his sway with Republican presidents to help place friendly officials in federal posts while protecting the Crump machine from federal investigation. So, Darren, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on this seemingly partnership between Boss Crump and Robert Church in terms of the political machine.
When I hear that, it sounds a little seedy. I mean, protecting them from federal investigation.
Right.
So, it sounds to me like that was the biggest thing that that Crump used Church for, was to protect him from his underdealings or under the table deals or whatever he was doing behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and pretty much if you have that protection, I mean, you have the power. You can do pretty much what you want to do.
Yeah.
So that was a really impactful sentence when I saw that it was a protecting from federal investigation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, you mentioned see at that time. And a lot of so at the presidential level was a lot of Democrats,
right?
Because again they had adopted the country had gone through some now they had not at that point they had not quite reached the Great Depression,
right? But
they had gone through some slumps in the economy and things like that people wanted. The government had started to enlarge coming out of the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so that growth in the government scared, people.
Exactly.
And that's
what I was going to say. That growth in the government, I mean, you got to think about it. At that time, it wasn't that you didn't feel as disconnected from national government as you probably do or may do now. A lot of people say they don't vote in national elections because they say it doesn't affect them. At this time, the government was much smaller.
Yeah.
When he said he had a pipeline from Beale Street to the White House, it probably sounds crazy now if you think about somebody that's working on Beale Street now and having direct access to the White House. But at that time, the government was much, much smaller and became bigger with the next president, which we'll, of course, get into. But
right. Yep, definitely. And so for those listening, I've got my guest here, Darren Ballard with the Minding Your Business podcast. And so we're just kind of discussing right now, this article of Memphis burning that was written by Preston Lauterbach back in 2016. And so you've got these two powerhouses, right, that come from, even though they're from the same hometown, they're kind of walking from opposite ends of the tracks, but they're able to insulate each other because they both benefit each other during this time. And so it's interesting. So there's a point into the 1930s, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Darren. But the article speaks of this. In the late 1930s, Boss Crump turned on his counterpart. In the span of a few years, the Democratic machine banished Bob Church, who's Robert Church Sr.'s son. So this is Robert Jr. we're talking about. So it banished him, seized his property, broke the family fortune, and dismantled his Republican organization, crushing the most vital arm of black enfranchisement in the city.
Like you might need to turn them again.
Yeah. So let me just let me go over that. Darren's right. Let me say that one more time. In the late 1930s, Boss Crump turned on his counterpart. In the span of a few years, the Democratic machine banished Bob Church, seized his property, broke the family fortune, and dismantled his Republican organization, crushing the most vital arm of black enfranchisement in the city. What say you, Mr. Ballard?
When they don't need you no more, you know. I mean, in my opinion, I'm thinking that Church, I don't think they were just like best friends. No, I think their relationship was more of a business relationship.
Yeah.
And of course, Church, with his dealings and learning from his father, was, I'm sure, a smart man, intelligent man.
Right.
He probably knew a day would come when that might happen. It might not thought it happened that soon,
right? Because
of and pretty much was accelerated by the Great Depression.
Yes.
But I'm pretty sure he knew that day would come, and that's something, man.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. And it's funny. And let's get into some of the reasons why real quick so we can kind of bring this home.
Yeah.
So I'm going to read this excerpt. The betrayal was mostly a matter of political expediency. With Franklin Roosevelt, who's President Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd president of the United States of America, when he went into the office, Crump no longer needed a Republican ally. So President Roosevelt was Republican, and he had ties to President Roosevelt, he being Boss Crump. So he no longer needed this ally in Bob Church or Robert Church Jr. As one of his operatives explained, Pendergrass, Daley, Roosevelt, Crump, the one characteristic that they all had in common was the ability, when necessary, to be absolutely and completely ruthless when it came to the organization. I don't care how close a person was to them, how loyal they'd been, and how much they had accomplished. As soon as they felt like they were no longer politically advantageous, out they went. But even by that callous standard, the excommunication of Bob Church was particularly vicious. Crump accused Church of spreading dangerous ideas, and he told the editor of the Black Memphis World, "You have a bunch of niggers teaching social equality, stirring up racial hatred. I am not going to stand for it. I've dealt with niggers all my life, and I know how to treat them. This is Memphis."
I'm sure he'd been waiting a long time to have that opportunity to express how he really felt.
Yeah, tell us how you really feel, Boss Crump, right? Let me give that quote one more time. This is a quote he gave the Black Memphis World, which is a newspaper at that time. "You have a bunch of niggers teaching social equality, stirring up racial hatred. I'm not going to stand for it. I've dealt with niggers all my life, and I know how to treat them. This is Memphis." Now, this is a man talking in the the late 1930s now.
Right.
You think he's talking in 2018.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, you can hardly tell the difference.
Right.
And, he didn't have a problem with Church preaching racial equality or advancing as long as he could get what he needed out of them.
Right.
But the time that he didn't need them, then, his true expressions came out. So
yeah, definitely. And so as you transition from that, and within the article, it begins to go into what we initially started the podcast with, Darren, which is, the burning down of the home at 384 South Lauderdale. And it says, when Crump turned on Church in the 1930s, the machine initiated the federally funded slum clearance of 10 blocks across the street from the Church family home. The problem was that it was no slum at all, but a stable, middle-class black neighborhood. The clearance area west of Lauderdale from Vance Avenue to Mississippi Boulevard featured houses that ranged in size from the Church Mansion, which was at 384 South Lauderdale, to from the Hooks family we mentioned earlier, their single-story, single-family home, and small businesses such as flower shops, groceries, cafes, and funeral parlors. The structures were no more than 60 years old, and the few surviving dwellings from that era attest to their sturdy construction. So some of those are still sitting there today when you go down Vance and Lauderdale and that area. So you look at this and you're saying the slum clearance. Now I'm getting to something that a lot of people, whether you're on Facebook Live or you're listening to this podcast, may be familiar with, is, well, what was that clearance, right? That clearance was for the construction of William H. Foote homes, okay, which, of course, now has been torn down. And we'll get into this in part 2 of kind of, what's going on today. But at that time, they essentially went in and they utilized the Memphis Housing Authority, okay, which was established back in the mid-1930s under Roosevelt's New Deal. Right. Darren, can you talk about the New Deal?
Yeah, and I think once you know about what the New Deal is and what it did, you kind of get a better understanding of how he was able to do these things.
Yeah.
So basically, the New Deal came in after the Great Depression. This was a package of programs and initiatives to pretty much get the country back on its feet. So when Roosevelt was elected, and of course he was a Democrat. So with him being a Democrat and Crump being a Democrat, he pretty much had his line to the White House, and he could get federal money to do different things in the guise of supposedly helping underserved communities.
Right.
So it goes to the government to ask for money, and they come up with the Memphis Housing Authority. With the Memphis Housing Authority, is created to provide housing for people who could not afford housing.
Right.
Instead, it was pretty much a trick because he's saying that he's using this money to help, but he's actually clearing out pretty much black neighborhoods that were thriving in Memphis.
Right.
So
because they were growing. That was the thing. They were thriving, and they were growing in population.
Right.
Yeah.
So with that, he pretty much took government money to clear those areas, to put up projects designated specifically for African Americans. So you think about that. They cleared out people who were independent, tax-paying citizens, making money, living their lives. Cleared that area out for projects.
Yeah.
That's why it's called a project.
That's why it's called
This was a specific project to keep black people in one place, to cull growth in our economy, our political clout, our political power, our vote. And it's a symbol. It's another symbol.
Right.
When those projects go up and you put black people all in one spot, no yards. All of that ties in together of how you grow up and what you see when you walk outside. So
right, and you keep the ownership. So if you limit home ownership, right, and you create this, like you say, this project where you basically have this cluster of one set of people, like you say, you could cut off the resources from it and you could control and manage it.
Right.
When you integrate it, right, now. And as that population were to continue to grow, what they saw is what people are afraid of today, which is this growth of population, to where people stand to take a loss in their political clout and their ability to control the means of production, which is basically through your politics.
Right.
And so it's interesting, and I want to speak to this from the article, Darren, in terms of the reasons why. So what you just described, let me support that with a little excerpt here. The Memphis Housing Authority, established in the mid-1930s, part of the wave of local authorities begun under Roosevelt's New Deal, leveled a 46-acre area and replaced the single-family homes with a low-rise, 900-unit public housing complex. As justification, the Housing Authority cited statistics showing the city's black population had doubled in less than 30 years. Densifying an existing black neighborhood was a racist strategy to prevent African Americans from encroaching on predominantly white areas. The complex, known as William H. Foote Homes, opened in 1940, directly across the street from the Robert Church House.
Now think about the year 1940. That's only 28 years before King was shot. So just to put a little perspective on the time frames, it wasn't that long ago.
No,
especially from that time, not even from now.
Yeah, no, not even from now, because you're talking 70, 79 years ago or so. So, in the grand scheme of things, not a whole, long time ago, right? Mm-hmm. What was left of the city's most prosperous integrated neighborhood began to deteriorate. Surrounded by dense, low-income housing, the fine Victoria homes were subdivided and turned into cheap rooming houses.
I want to start right there. Now, think about if you're from Memphis and you've probably gone downtown, you've probably seen some of those rooming houses.
Yeah.
And
they still exist today.
Still exist today.
Mm-hmm.
So, just to think about, if you look at the history, how you can connect it to what's going on in the city now, just to think about the rooming houses downtown. So
right. That were once homes for prominent, black, middle class
families. Pretty much a one-house project.
Yeah.
Because it was the same way. They took that house and started making rooms for black people to live in.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, exactly. So it says the city, which had previously allowed Bob Church to skip paying property taxes, foreclosed on his estate and auctioned off 10 properties to pay the tax debt.
So now we get into what he also got out of deal with him and Crump.
Right.
He pretty much got to skip on the taxes.
Yeah, he got to skip out on taxes. So they both are at this point benefiting from the political system. So then when Mayor Crump, or Boss Crump at this time, so he's not mayor at this point, but he's still running stuff.
Right.
So he's got this mob figure type thing going. Well, both of them did.
And a lot of people don't realize that when you're in office, you have less power than when you're outside of office and have gained a certain political clout. Because when you're in office, you have to adhere to certain constituents and what their needs are. When you have political clout and you're not in office, you can pretty much maneuver around from this party to that party and that politician to that politician, because you pretty much have nobody to answer to on a level as far as the government. So
yeah, definitely. And so, the article goes into some background with Nathan Bedford Forrest and all that kind of thing. So we're not going to worry about that. His statue's gone. So nobody's worried about that right now. Shout out to everybody that's worked on that piece of it, because again, it goes back to the symbolism, and that's why that was so important. And so, thankful. And those that are listening to the podcast may have seen the national news in terms of several months ago where the Nathan Bedford Forrest statue was removed from a park here in Memphis. And that's a symbolism of racial inequality and discord and things like that, and just pure hatred. And so that was removed, and some people didn't quite understand the importance of that. But like you and I've talked about, brother, this is about the symbolism of it. So nothing should be erected that's a symbol of racial hate. I don't care how they looked or what they were part of or where they were from. Nothing should be a symbol of something like that.
And let's make no mistake, the same people who oppose the statue being taken down and say that it's only a symbol, trust me, to them it's more than a symbol. They know.
Yeah, they know.
They know the history behind it.
Right, exactly.
They were taught. Their families teach those things and pass them along. So they may say, "Oh, it's just a symbol."
Yeah, it's just a statue.
Why do you care?
Yeah,
they know the symbolism and what it means to them.
That's why they're so passionate about it.
Right. So if it's just a symbol, then why do you care if it comes down or not?
Right. It's because when you teach it, it becomes a symbol that then you use to again embed into the minds of people, and then like you say, you teach from it. So let me get into where the article kind of takes a little bit of a turn, Darren, and starts talking about connecting as to what was contributing to with the Memphis Housing Authority and that kind of thing coming in. So the year that the Robert Church home was burned down in 1953, the Memphis Urban League reported that median income for black households, now keep in mind this is in 1953, was $1,348 annually, less than half the white median at $3,085.
And I did the math on that. 1,000 then is about $10,000 in today's.
Okay.
money. So
Yeah.
$10,000 a year, pretty much.
Right. Gotcha. Roughly 23,000 black families lived in extreme poverty, again, 1953, making less than $1,000 annually. Now, I couldn't even imagine making less than $1,000.
Try surviving on $10,000 today.
Right, today.
A
right.
year.
Yeah, a year,
So,
right. No doubt about it. And more black families were grouped in the sub $500 category than any other bracket. Can anyone be amazed when these people appear in large numbers on relief rolls in juvenile and criminal courts and as contributors to illegitimacy delinquency, observed an official of the Urban League? Their plight is the result of cheap labor, poor schools, and slums. Inequality was also firmly established at the upper end of the scale. Of the 4,000 black families earning $10,000 or more annually, again, this is back in 1953, only 35 were black. So out of 4,000 families at this time in Memphis, Tennessee, that were earning $10,000 or more annually, okay, only 35 were black. 1953.
Now let's think about that cheap labor. And what were those three things? Cheap labor.
Yep. So the three things are cheap labor, poor schools, and slums.
So you think about cheap labor, and this was in what, 50?
This is 53.
And you think about 13 years later, why King was in Memphis, was to support the sanitation workers who were not being paid.
Right.
You think about it even today when you got warehouses all across Memphis, and you have temporary agencies that pretty much use cheap labor to move, buy, store millions of dollars of product. So, I mean, just to tie it from that point to now, I mean,
yes, that speaks to the culture, because you're right. In Memphis, you have a culture of, like you say, kind of the utilization of cheap labor to be able to, because it's a distribution hub. As it's been, because that was established back even prior to this time that we're talking about, in terms of slave trade that moved up the Mississippi from New Orleans. Memphis was kind of a port for that. You had cotton was a big commodity at that point, and you could utilize cheap, almost free labor to be able to move that distribution. So it's funny in 2018 how you still have where they utilize temp agencies. So you're not utilizing people from a slave standpoint in the overt sense.
Still using those distribution routes.
Right. You use the
Still
same
using those railroads.
Yeah.
Still using the center of Memphis being by the Mississippi River.
Right.
Those same things. I mean,
the only thing you've added in is planes.
Right. Exactly. and then what do we have here? FedEx.
Right. Yeah. So it's built off that distribution of utilizing labor. To be able to move, like you said, millions and billions of dollars of product all around the world.
Yeah. It's not people now, of course. It's goods and,
it's goods.
Things like that. But
goods, raw materials.
At one point, we were the goods moving through those same distribution routes.
Right. So goods and raw materials. No doubt about it. Okay. Again, excerpt from the article. Crump is the master behind the city's narrative, and his legacy lives on. His rule was so absolute following his destruction of the Black Republican organization that the boss faced no real opposition. He handpicked local officials and candidates who did things the Crump way. According to former machine operative Guy Bates, Crump's reign did lasting damage to the city's long-term development. When the boss died in 1954, he left no heir, and his style of governing allowed no room for competing visions or compromise. No one was ready to take over. Okay, so he transitions, speaking of Boss Crump, he transitions life, he dies, and he doesn't leave any kind of heir or anything. Why do you think that was?
You know what, that's a good question. I'm probably because the way that his machine moved, with him calling himself boss, he probably didn't want to allow anybody to get that particular power while he still had power. He said, I guess he pretty much said the power was going to die with me. After I'm gone, I really don't care what happens. So if he had pretty much heirs to his political clout, then they may have used what he taught them while he was still alive against him, and he may not have had the ability to maintain the clout that he had.
Yeah, definitely. So what's up, Lawrence Thompson? Just shouting out some of the folks on Facebook Live that's joined us. Greg Bernard, Data Maxim, IT specialist, IT guru.
Nice.
That you need to hire when you have your IT issues or you're looking to build an IT infrastructure within your company. Great guy right there, Greg Bernard, who you need to reach out to, datamaxim.com. Navonda Jackson, what's up, sis? What's going on? Avon rep extraordinaire. Ladies, if you need to get your stuff together, you need to see Navonda Jackson. You can catch her on my Facebook. Search her out, inbox her, and she can get with you in terms of your Avon needs. So, good stuff there, man, with our folks. So, what followed Foot Homes, then was Claiborne Homes.
Right.
So now you're in this period, Darren, where they're using the housing authority, again, coming from the federal government through this new deal, like a raw deal, but new deal coming from President Roosevelt. And so now there's this justification going on, right, for the inequality. And so you're building these housing projects, kind of around town. Now, when we get to part 2, we can talk some about how those projects are now, many have been decimated, and they've been followed with other, not necessarily projects per se, but other initiatives that then solve a different. They solve one problem, but they may create another problem, and we could talk about that in part 2. But following the burning down of Robert Church's home, you started to have this overt initiative from locals, white locals in neighborhoods to prevent blacks from moving in.
Right.
And the article talks about that because there was a bombing that happened in that area and what was going on, and it speaks to this in the article, and I'll read it. Of course, poverty and crime are the symptoms of inequality, not its root cause. To truly understand racial inequality in America, you have to start with housing. In Memphis, inequality between black and white citizens is enforced at the neighborhood level, block by block, house by house. Okay? So what began to happen, but there's a house that was bombed. Again, this is after the church property. South Memphis could have been the model for an integrated Memphis. The bomb changed all that. The house that exploded at 430 East Olive Avenue, so this is just down the street and around the corner from 384 Lauderdale, had been recently sold to the Williams family, the 6th or 7th black household to move into a neighborhood of small cottages occupied mainly by whites. Apparently that was one black family too many. Soon after they moved in, white neighbors formed a violent, reactionary mob, shouting epithets at the new residents, patrolling the streets, and taking down for sale signs. They threatened to tar and feather homeowners who sold to black buyers. So they were going to even embarrass and hurt their own people to do that. They threatened to tar and feather homeowners who sold to black buyers. When they see a house being shown, they round up the mob. And this is quoted by a Mrs. L.C. Lawser, a white resident of East Olive. It's like the Paul Revere signal. The explosion ignited citywide discussion of the housing problem as a rapidly growing black population challenged the status quo of racially segregated neighborhoods. African-American leader Benjamin Hooks, the future NAACP director and FCC commissioner who had grown up on Lauderdale near the Church family, wrote to the mayor, "There's an urgent need or urgent demand for additional housing facilities for Negroes, which can only be met by natural area expansion, the extension of Negro home ownership into ever-widening areas. This was a clear warning that the clash on Olive Avenue would be repeated as black families continue their movement into formerly all-white neighborhoods." 2 months after the bombing, a group of white Olive Avenue residents called on the mayor. They planned to sell their homes, and they wanted the city's protection from the mob. All right. So now white people are getting with the mayor, who at that time and they want protection. They want to be able to sell their homes. They said, Mr. Mayor, these Negroes who have moved in there seem to be a fine class of Negroes, remarked one. They keep up their homes and they look better than when the white people owned them. Say that again, lady. She said, they keep up their homes and they look better than when the white people owned them. The group assured the mayor that they didn't object to the presence of blacks. We object to the presence of the whites. These are white people. They object to they wanted the black folks.
You got to think about this. What is this, 19?
This is the 1950s. Right? Miss Billingsley, how you doing? Joining us on the Facebook Live. What's going on? Yeah, this is 1950s, Darren. What's up?
That's something, man. I mean,
can you believe that?
I mean, you would hardly you can imagine somebody saying that in 2018.
Right, exactly. So this lady talking about, they keep up their homes and look better than when the white people own them. We want to sell to them, but we don't want your mob coming to tear it all down or to tar and feather us. Right. That's what she's saying. But in any case, they were getting out. One owner reported, "My husband says he'll move and let that house sit there empty before he'll stay there." I'm going to ask you about that here in a second, Darren. We do not want our children in that situation. Another neatly summarized the theme of the next 5 decades of Memphis history, telling the mayor. Now I want everybody to put their pen right here on this particular comment, because I'm going to ask Darren about this. And if you're on Facebook Live, I want to hear from you. Here's the quote. You have to get out of that neighborhood if you want decent children. I'm going to say that again. This is a quote to the mayor by a white woman back in the 1950s who was wanting to sell her home on Olive Avenue to a black family who they all agreed were better than the white families who had been there before, by the way, in talking to the mayor. She says this: you have to get out of that neighborhood if you want decent children. Okay, so Darren, I'm gonna ask you about your thoughts on the residents on Olive Avenue, right around the corner from Lauderdale in South Memphis, in the 1950s, going to the mayor because they want protection from the mobs that are threatening to tar and feather anybody that's sold to a black family. Yeah. They want to do it. They need this protection from the mayor, but then they're threatening to, if they can't sell to these black families, they'll say to hell with it and leave it there to rot. Your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's a pretty explosive. That's a tough stance to take. Being white in the 1950s, wanting to sell to black residents. I mean, think about that. In the 1950s, they want to sell to black residents instead of their white counterparts.
Why do you think they want to sell?
I think they wanted to sell. I think they wanted to move. They admired the black population and what they built and how they conducted themselves in the neighborhood, but they still didn't want to be around them.
Right, and that's what I was going
to say.
They still didn't
want to be around.
So it almost sounds like they want to be righteous,
right?
But it's really not. It's a righteous.
It's almost an embedded thing. Like you have all of the proof that these black families keep their homes up, go to work every day, just like I assume these white families did. But there was still something deep seated that they still did not want to be in their neighborhood.
Right. Well, see, what I think it is I think the righteousness was a front for the racism. And here's why I say that. They wanted to sell. There's a reason they wanted to sell, because the black population was growing, right? There's also the economics of they own this home. They want to make money, right? They're not trying to give it away.
Right.
They bought the house.
Exactly.
With money they had, acquired in some sort of way, or felt that they earned. So there's an economic sense that they use the righteousness to cover up the economic piece of their racism. Right. Which was, no, they didn't want to be around them. They could have damn about being around them. But the ones that they felt were, quote unquote, the nicest of them, the good coloreds, hey, they're good. They're going to come in and do right by it.
Right.
We trying to get out. Now, where are we trying to go? Right?
Right.
East Memphis. Say at this time. At this time, they're wanting to go north and south. right?
Exactly.
So they're trying to sell their homes to go to Whitehaven, right? Because Whitehaven was Kent's Whitehaven,
Right.
the part of Memphis. They wanted to go to. It was a farming community,
And not only that,
south of the city.
They wanted to go to Fraser, which they did.
Yeah,
they wanted to go to Fraser,
north
Raleigh,
of Fraser, because these
Bartlett.
were at this time these were kind of very rural. There was a lot of inexpensive land,
right.
and they could escape the city and this growth population of blacks.
Mm-hmm.
So they could go there, build their own schools, their own infrastructure, still have access to the city. Because keep in mind, during this time in the 50s and all that, this is when the expressway is getting built.
Right.
So now you've got the expressway highway system being built, and cars are being built slightly more efficiently at this time. You're starting to get things like automatic transmissions and all these type of things that are making driving easier.
Exactly.
Power
Travel.
steering starts showing up in cars and all that. So, and the ability to purchase a car. So being able to have multiple cars in a family and things like that gets easier.
Right, because 20 years ago, owning a car was pretty much only for the wealthiest of wealthy. So at this time, it's like you said, it's more cars are being built, easy access. Pretty much how anything that comes about. Like at one point, VCRs or whatever was a status symbol until the production increases, and then they become available for everybody. So
yeah, definitely. So on Facebook Live, Tytra Billingsley. She says, very refreshing to hear the story of the city. My parents and myself are not originally from Memphis, so the info was not passed down. Sounds like a false narrative was created before valid concerns existed. So Tytra, definitely, and I appreciate your comment here on Facebook Live. Although you're not from Memphis, and your parents may not have been, depending on how long and stuff you were here, they may not have known or had shared with them this type of history, and that's why we want to do that here on this particular podcast and tied it in, of course, to our normal business presentation. Because this affects all business, right? Everything that we're doing today in this city goes back to this culture. And this one line that this article, for the remaining part of the article, centers around the one line that the lady gave the mayor, which was, you have to get out of that neighborhood if you want decent children. Mm-hmm. Because what happened here in Memphis was, this is where you started having the annexation. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that you have what's called white flight, as white people moved out of cores of cities. And this isn't just limited to Memphis, like you said earlier, Darren. This is all around the country.
Right.
This is kind of a repetitive thing. And in Memphis, it was pretty stark because you had people moving. First, they went north and south. Mm-hmm. Then they went east. So, like you said, they went to Fraser. Mm-hmm. They went to Whitehaven. Then they followed each of them east as the black population continued to grow, and they started expanding. And then what the city found out was they took the impression that they should chase those people around and just annex the land into the city versus address the core of the city to draw them back in. So that's what the leadership chose to do. And so what you've got, and the article speaks to this, is that you had this flight going on and the population is not growing. So you've got a population in Memphis where the population isn't growing, but the geography is, which is putting pressure and stress on the city to provide resources to, in some cases, densely or not as densely populated areas, very rural areas of the city. So it's very interesting, to be able to see that. Darren, you spoke earlier of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who came here April of 1968 for the city sanitation workers strike. And then he gets struck in the neck with a bullet. You've got Negroes standing all around him pointing. Ain't nobody trying to get him no help. Right. So I've said that to a few people. Because you see the picture of them pointing while he's sitting there, on the balcony bleeding. It's like, what the hell, But anyway, that's a whole different podcast to get into that. But so this is a transition into the late 1960s, which some people have said this is when the city died kind of unofficially was when Dr. King was assassinated here in Memphis, Tennessee at the Lorraine Motel. Right. Connect that dot for us. As you come out of this Crump era, you've got these disciples of Crump that have come into play. And you had the mayor at that time, Henry Loeb, disciple of the Crump era, followed his beliefs and his thoughts and his tradition. And he was part of the one that was restricting or initiating that what resulted in the labor dispute by not paying the sanitation workers. Right. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's one of the biggest pieces that really connects Memphis to now, because pretty much after Dr. King was assassinated here, there was a long period of just pure stagnation as far as economic growth, development, and in the black communities around the city. So I think that was a big turning point that pretty much shut down a lot of growth in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And so there's a lot of impact from that, social, economic, just the overall culture and feel of the city. And I want to share something from the article as we kind of draw to a close a bit. Darren, and I want to read this excerpt from the article for us. Historian Kenneth T. Jackson of Columbia University is a prominent scholar of suburbanization and author of The Crabgrass Frontier. He's also a Memphian, born and raised during the Crump reign. And his quote, 70 years ago, Memphis, Atlanta, and Dallas were more or less in the same place. So Memphis, Atlanta, and Dallas were at the same level, according to Kenneth T. Jackson. They were in the same place size-wise. Memphis had the advantage of the Mississippi River, as well as rail and interstate highway connections. Its economy should have kept pace with, if not surpassed, its southern peers, Atlanta and Dallas. Instead, Jackson said, it got obliterated by other cities. While Atlanta leadership embraced a racially progressive, pro-business attitude behind Mayor Ivan Allen, adopting the slogan, "The city too busy to hate," Memphis got on the wrong side of the civil rights revolution, Jackson said. I will put a lot of the blame on Henry Loeb, who was the mayor at the time. He recalled watching the TV news the day of King's funeral in Atlanta and seeing the mayor of that city hold an umbrella for Coretta Scott King. Same night, same news, Henry Loeb was apologetic, talking about how outside agitators had caused all of this. Jackson said, as the nation mourned, white leaders in Memphis were tragically out of step. Time called Memphis a decaying Mississippi River town, blaming the assassination on intransient white mayor Henry Loeb and his refusal to meet modest wage and compensation demands. Now, of course, we know that the assassination of Dr. King goes, far beyond that. There were forces and things like that were involved at levels higher than Henry Loeb. Right. So I don't think we would mistake that. But what are your thoughts on that when you hear that comparison of Memphis to Atlanta and Dallas, and how being on what Mr. Jackson's saying, the wrong side of the civil rights movement impacted the city's growth compared to those cities?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of that's a big point that a lot of people make, and I'm sure some of the viewers have that, and listeners have some of that some of those same feelings, as far as Atlanta and Dallas or Houston. I mean, if you live in Memphis, the talent, the vibrant people who live here, and you probably wonder why Memphis never grew or did not have the same economic developments that Atlanta and other cities had.
Yeah.
So, I mean, pretty much with Henry Loeb, after the assassination of Dr. King, with him pretty much blaming outside agitators, which I'm pretty sure he meant Dr. King also.
Right.
His response to the Dr. King's assassination is what made the city, and which pretty much was set the climate for Memphis. Now think about if he had gone a totally different direction. Of course, he wouldn't have, but
right,
coming from as a Crump disciple.
Mm-hmm.
But that stuff weighs down on people.
Right.
I mean, just think about when you hear the president say things, and that sets a national climate. So what his response to Dr. King's assassination set the climate for Memphis.
Mm-hmm.
That it really didn't mean anything, and it was pretty much his fault that he got killed here. And we should go back or keep things the way they are, because you see what happens when somebody comes in and agitates.
Yeah, as it starts to rile up, right, and things like that. So, like you say, he deflected.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no ownership. There was no, remorse or things like that. It was basically play the blame game and deflect. And so people may not just realize how powerful that was at that time and what that did for the city and how the city was viewed.
It was an important thing. I mean, if you're living in that time, you're talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, how important he is now and how people feel about him now and what he has done, how they feel about that now.
Right.
You got to think about if you're living in that time and you're living in Memphis.
Yeah.
And you're a black living in Memphis. And the city that you live in is where the most popular civil rights leader is assassinated.
Right.
And then you have the leader of your city, the elected leader of your city, respond in that way.
Yeah.
Just think about what kind of seeds that sets among the population and how that gets passed down. Maybe not on purpose, but it's just a feeling.
Right.
Like you said earlier, going back to Memphis Madness,
mm-hmm.
that stuff, those energies get passed along.
Right. Exactly.
And when you start to be excited about things that are going on in the city, you start to progress.
Mm-hmm.
When you become depressed about stuff that things that go on in the city, you start to regress.
Right.
So it is really important what his response to Dr. King's assassination.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And so what I want to do, Darren, thank you so much, man, for coming on and, for this part one. And what I want to do is I want to put a pin there because mm-hmm. what I want to do is come back for part two. And I want to, in part two of Memphis Burning, which will be actually episode 65. So we're going to wrap up here episode 64. And then when we get to episode 65, I want to get into the transition into now, today. Mm-hmm. So how this culture has, kind of permeated itself into today's mm-hmm. culture, coming from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s into Memphis culture today. And then most importantly, what are some things that we can be doing to help support some of the great initiatives that are transforming the culture into more of a progressive culture here in Memphis. Because people always talk about the potential of Memphis and mm-hmm. things like that. What are some things we got to do to reach that potential and maximize that?
It's time to start. You can say that the city has potential all you want to. Your face turns blue, but until we start putting that potential into actual energy.
Yeah.
And getting out and doing the things that we need to do to make the city what it could and what it should be.
Yeah.
Then we'll be forever talking about its potential.
Right. Exactly. So we're going to get into that here on episode 2. So y'all come back, you check out episode 2, part 2 of Memphis Burning, this series on the Minding Your Business podcast. For my guest, man, Darren Ballard, thank you so much, brother.
Pleasure,
I appreciate you, man. We're going to have you for part 2. I'm your host, Champ Ron, and let's continue. This is about history. It's about education. If you're on the Facebook Live, be sure to comment in. You can inbox me. You can also reach me, Ron, at themybpodcast.com. Ron at themybpodcast.com. Good, bad, ugly. Share it with me. If you agree, you disagree, if you've got more to add, definitely do that. You can check us out, www.themybpodcast.com is the website. Share this podcast, subscribe to it. We're on all the podcast networks, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, Spreaker, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio. Go to them all, check us out. And, of course, you can join me on Facebook Live, Gerald Ron Brooks, on Facebook. Follow me there. Follow our Facebook page for the Minding Your Business podcast. You can find us all out there. So we out here. We want to educate, and that way we know where we've been so that we can shape a new narrative for where we're going. Champ Ron, y'all be great.